Welcome to class, comrades. This is Reexamination, a show where instead of discussing the news, hot button issues, or pop culture, we're discussing history and political theory. I'm Hunter.
And I'm Dani.
Today we're going to be learning about the labor movement in the United States of America.
In the early British American colonies, labor was primarily performed by indentured servants. Between 1630 and the American Revolution, nearly two-thirds of European immigrants came to this continent as indentured servants. By the beginning of the war in 1775, only 2% of colonial labor forces were indentures. Debt peonages, a similar system, was used by New Englanders on Native Americans in an attempt to assimilate them.
Now, I didn't know before researching all of this that many Europeans came to the country as indentured servants. Like when you read the history, like in school or whatever, you think that they're all just coming across as like free people on boats or whatever to just work in jobs and just move here. This immigrated normally, and no, they were servants.
100%. I definitely thought it was gonna. I had concepts of it being more like how Australia was, where it was like, oh, criminals, yeah, just put them.
That's
put them there.
certainly happens. We'll talk about that in a minute too.
Yeah. But yeah, I do think it was an interesting fact, and now we know, and now our viewers know,
And listeners.
and listeners.
Indentured servants did not earn an income, but worked to provide the cost of food, lodgings, and to pay off debts over the course of a 1 to 7 year contract. This was a dangerous job, and because of the high death rates, it was used for punitive measures, like we talked about.
Okay. It was around this time that the transatlantic slave trade was beginning. There was already Native American slavery happening by Spanish colonizers as soon as they arrived in this hemisphere. But in 1526, Portugal was the first European nation to bring African slaves to the Americas. The British mainland American colonies began importing African slaves first as indentured servants later that same year. Over 12 million slaves over the course of 4 centuries would be transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. 5% of this, a little shy of 600,000 slaves, were brought to the mainland British colonies and later the United States.
Yeah, so what do you think about all those numbers?
So I always knew that the numbers that were brought over to the United States was lower than everyone else because historically, like,
More slaves went to other places in the Americas.
not even that. More slaves went to other places, but they were male slaves. While the United States had both female and male slaves, and that's why the first state to ban the selling or the bringing over of slaves wasn't because they didn't want any more slaves coming over. They didn't want slavery. It's because they saw slaves as a product that would always bring more products because reproduction. So that's how I always knew that we didn't bring over a lot of slaves, but we had more than anyone else because we were taking families apart.
Well, we didn't have more than everyone else. Maybe over time, our population of
What I meant is population-wise.
eventually, over time, I guess it grew and grew. But yeah, so that was interesting. Also, Portugal. Come on, guys.
I'm not surprised about Spanish colonizers as someone whose family was, technically the byproduct of Spanish colonization. I am quite not surprised.
Well, Portugal, they were the first. Spain, the second. Not too long after that,
Yeah.
the British and French got involved too. But yeah, so that's it was pretty rough times. And while we could do a whole episode on slavery, we are not going to discuss it too much further here. It is important to know that in early American history that labor was hardly a choice. There were landowning farmers, fishermen, dock workers, and craftsmen, sure, but a significant number of indentured servants and slaves to perform work in the household and in the fields. After all, in the early years of this nation, this was a country of farmers. Servants and slaves were not the entirety of the nation's labor force, though, due to the belief that Britain was overpopulated and that competition for work drove down the price of labor. The poor and criminals were shipped out en masse. My ancestor was shipped to the Americas aboard a ship full of criminals. He stole shoelaces, apparently, just to get free passage to the Americas.
I think that's really interesting about like your little like I'm always dropping Dani background, but I think this is like really cool hunter background.
Yeah, I found this one out a few years ago. I didn't know the shoelace bit. I just know that he showed up in the 1770s, before America was America.
Got some. He's like, I'm gonna commit a crime to get to the other side.
Yeah, I mean, people's prospects, if you're low income in England back then, were not great. What are you gonna do?
I mean, people's prospects, if you're low income in England now, is not great.
True, but now they don't have a whole other continent to go to for free if they steal some shoelaces.
That's true. That is a valid response to that. I mean, low income people have no options, is basically what it is.
Anywhere, ever.
But in terms of skilled labor, sort of like today, people often learn trades through apprenticeships. There were voluntary and involuntary apprenticeship programs. In-demand trades required premiums be paid to the mentor, and apprenticeships lasted from age 14 to 21. Mentors were required to train and educate their apprentices. The colonies offered journeymen, who were free workers, good pay, and lots of work. Unlike today, where we have a minimum wage, back then, workers had a maximum wage and a minimum for hours worked.
Yeah, they didn't want workers getting paid too much money, because then people were feeling like the free workers were just spending all of that money on like luxury goods. So they'd like wear clothes that people thought were too nice for them, and they would like just spend all their time in taverns just drinking, their free time away.
Oh no, people using their money how they want to see fit.
I know.
Why do I feel like that's what's still happening nowadays? They're like, the poors should not have iPhones. If you're truly broke, why do you have a cell phone? The amount of times I've heard that.
Why are your shoes costing you $500?
You shouldn't have this handbag. I'm like, it feels like we have not moved past this, I should say.
We have not. The poors cannot have nice things, apparently.
No. It should only be hand-me-downs and bad things that you have to continuously replace.
No high quality anything.
No.
During the 18th century, the earliest forms of organized labor began popping up in England, but it took longer to take hold in the U.S. There were some trades that banded together to set higher wages, but any early strike or protest was harshly put down by authorities. Much like today, white servitude did not end until 1830s under President Andrew Jackson's administration. Andrew Jackson. Well, if there's anything that he did.
He did!
And indentured servitude, for white people at least.
Yeah. That's all the positives we can say about him.
That's all we got.
America doubled down on apprenticeships and workshops to compete with British industrialization due to the cost and capital required to open up factories. Americans continued to strike rather than unionize as their primary form of voicing grievances, dating back to the first decade after the Revolution, which saw striking shoemakers in New York, journeyman printers in Philadelphia, and bakers in Charleston.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that unions didn't catch on in the U.S. until later, and that we just striked a lot. It also shows you that things haven't really changed. In the first half of the 19th century, American industrialism started booming. By 1800, skilled tradesmen were making 75 to 100% more than non-tradesmen. Masters and journeymen's associations were sort of like early unions and were described as mutual aid societies. They provided support to widows, the sick, and unemployed while offering loans and credit to their members.
I think that's really nice about the mutual aid, and I think it's really interesting that we still use some terminology back, like journeyman and masters. Like that's still something that's deep in union culture.
Yeah,
I think it's
that stuff was based back then, and it's based today.
It was from sun up to sundown, and 12-hour working days were common. Despite this, they did not live to work and thoroughly enjoyed their leisure time, as Karl Marx also spoke heavily about. By 1828 and through the 1930s, the labor movement began to spread throughout America. We got real unions and political organizations known as working men parties. Pay was low, and nearly half of workers weren't making enough to live comfortably for them or their families. Many relied on money earned by their children to get by.
Gotta love that child labor.
Yeah, and we're kind of reverting to that. A lot of new child labor laws are like, hey, 14-year-old, you can work past this time, and here's more time. And
the children yearn for the mines.
Oh, that's messed up.
It's terribly messed up.
I think another thing that's really interesting is working man parties. I think that's still kind of prevalent today. Like I know like the working families party is like a really cool third party that focuses on working families.
Yeah. Focusing on labor issues and stuff like that. It's important.
Yeah. And we do love our leisure time.
Yes, can't forget to talk about Daddy Marx.
At least once an episode.
Yes, it all comes back to him. He's the man.
God.
In the 1870s and 1880s, socialism and communism spread amongst the ideologies of the big labor unions and trade organizations in the major cities across the country. In 1872, 100,000 New Yorkers performed a strike and walkout for an 8-hour workday. 1877 saw Pittsburgh iron workers clash with soldiers sent out from Philadelphia. The Knights of Labor was an organization that recruited workers from all over the country, from glassblowers to cowboys. The Knights also opposed strikes unless the victims... I need to redo that. I completely skipped like half the line. All right, go ahead. The Knights opposed strikes unless workers were being victimized or employers refused to negotiate. In 1881, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions was founded as a lobbying organization until they launched a nationwide campaign for the 8-hour workday. In 1886, this organization was replaced by the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL.
Okay, I think the Cowboys thing is kind of really interesting. That's like every time
they got everybody.
Every time I read this and every time like I hear it, I'm just like, oh, this is really cool.
Glass blowers to cowboys.
It's cowboys, like
the Cowboy Union.
I love that. I know it's a silly little thing to like really focus on, but I'm just like.
But like the actual cowboys, not like the rootin' tootin' shootin'. Wild West types, but like ranchers and
people who are
farm hands,
the people who feed the people.
Yeah.
So in 1892, New Orleans was known for biracial unionism when white workers were offered 10-hour workdays, but not black workers. Unions shut down the city. Eugene V. Debs cited the strike as the hope for civilization and the supreme glory of mankind. Debs, a prominent socialist of his time, worked in the American Railway Union, a powerful group that in the early 1890s disrupted trade and commerce around the country through the Pullman strike, involving 27 states and 250,000 workers. President Cleveland used the U.S. Army and local authorities to crack down on protesters and imprisoning Debs for 6 months for defying court injunction over the strike.
Yeah, the reasoning for that was because it was disrupting the mail system. The mail wasn't getting to where it needed to be, so they got the army involved. Also, fun fact about Eugene Debs. He was the socialist candidate for the presidency in at least 3 elections.
Okay, Eugene, I see you. No one else sees you,
He-
but I see you.
He didn't win.
Oh, clearly, because we know most people haven't heard of Eugene Debs.
But it would have been cool if he did.
Would have been amazing if he did. Imagine how different.
Oh my god.
We probably wouldn't be in the worst timeline anymore.
Ooh, true. We might not be in the worst timeline.
We might have actually been in a good timeline at that point.
Ooh, what if?
This is the bad place.
While all of this was occurring, so were the Cold Wars. From 1890 to 1930, a series of conflicts erupted on behalf of the miners, primarily in Appalachia, and then later also in Colorado. During this time, companies set up company towns for their workers to live in and were provided certain amenities from, but termination meant eviction. Companies paid private detectives and local law enforcement to harshly crack down on union organization. There were a few dozen strikes and conflicts occurring during this time, the largest being the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia. 10,000 striking workers, guided by socialist and labor organizer Mother Jones, clashed with company cronies until intervention by the West Virginia National Guard. Unions were crushed in the state for years and didn't resume until the 30s during the peak of FDR's New Deal.
I'm sensing a theme here of using the army and armed forces to crush the little man.
Yes. It happened in the past. It happens today. It's likely going to keep happening unless we do something about it.
Outside of the mines were the factories, like Henry Ford's blossoming automobile business. Henry Ford has a reputation for popularizing the 5-day work week, but it was definitely not his invention. The 5-day work week was introduced in 1908 in New England so that Jewish workers would not have to work on Saturdays. In 1926, Ford introduced this schedule into his factories, and the first union demanded this from their employers in 1928. This would not become law until 1940, when the Fair Labor Standards Act came into full effect, and a 40-hour work week with weekends off became the norm.
I did a lot of research into the Ford Motor Company
I'm
and
sorry.
the history of automobiles leading up to this. And the first automobiles, as we kind of know them today, were German.
Yeah.
In Germany. And Henry Ford wasn't even the first American to build an automobile.
I did not know that part.
Yes. The first American automobile was the Oldsmobile. Yes.
To the Oldsmobile!
And we had Oldsmobiles around until the early 2000s when that company went under.
That's wild.
Yeah. They were bought very early on by GM.
Okay.
So they were under the GM umbrella for a really long time.
Okay, so that makes sense. All my homies hate Ford, but like Henry Ford.
Yes.
Specifically, every time everyone's like, "Oh yeah, he did the 5-day," I was like, "Nope, Jewish people did the 5-day work week."
Yes, and it's especially important to say Jewish people, are the reason we have the 5-day work week, because Henry Ford was very
Anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And really, he's like, oh, he wanted Jewish people to have the Saturdays off so they could buy things. Like, he wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He was definitely doing this money.
Everyone to be able to buy things.
Yeah.
There was a profit motive involved with giving people days off.
A true capitalist at heart.
Ugh.
I mean, I'll give him his props on the whole, like, assembly line and, like, having things built that way. Like, he was, like...
Efficient.
Yeah, he was one of the first people to do that. I will give him credit where credit is due. I don't like doing that very often.
Yeah, that extra day for leisure just screams Karl Marx.
It does. It really does. And now we're trying to go for a 32-hour work week.
Yes, we
Fingers
talked about
crossed.
that one.
This is complemented by protective measures for which support was growing across the country. In 1911, the fire in New York City's Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory saw 148 lives, predominantly young women, lost due to harsh and cruel working conditions, such as factory doors being chained shut to prevent workers from leaving. This caused expanded activity from the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and caused others to further advocate for workers' rights and just compensation.
Yeah, that was really a disaster. And the fact that they were able to just legally chain the doors shut to prevent people from leaving, not getting their work done, or stealing things. Just, hey, you're not allowed to leave your job. Yeah. You're stuck here.
Now that's just a fire. Now that's a fire code violation. And
I mean, yeah, certainly. Yeah. It's also not legal in
no, yeah, it's not legal. Well, it's not legal, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, is how I'll phrase that.
In what situations nowadays does that happen?
Sweatshops and, like, other forced labor areas. I'm talking, like, not
internationally.
Yeah, and in America, you think America doesn't have sweatshops?
No, we don't like to think about American sweatshops.
I know we don't like to think about American sweatshops, but they exist, and it's primarily women and children and immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
So, the disenfranchised and those who need our help the most.
We're not supposed to have sweatshops.
We're not supposed to have sweatshops. But unfortunately, we live under capitalism.
But think about it. We don't have to. And speaking of that, all of this labor movement was not for nothing. And people were beginning to stand up for their rights to their own labor. Membership for the International Workers of the World, or the IWW, a group co-founded by Mother Jones and labor powerhouses like Bill Haywood, swelled. Groups like the AFL deemed the IWW too radical for their tastes, and the IWW saw the AFL as too conservative and disliked how they divided the labor movement by trades. 1905 saw hundreds of working American leftists gathering in Chicago. Membership grew until just after World War I, when the first Red Scare saw crackdowns on membership and jailing many labor leaders. Haywood would go on to flee the country to Soviet Russia rather than face trial. This trend continued during the second Red Scare during the Cold War. Yeah, it's a lot going on there. I would like to note that Haywood was the guy.
The guy?
Like, so from what I read, Eugene Debs, he didn't see himself as like an actual leader.
Oh.
He saw himself as a person who's there to help people help themselves. He saw Haywood as the leader figure that American workers should rally behind. He wanted Haywood to be the face.
Interesting. I like that. That's...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe the farthest, the highest position that Haywood had was like some secretary positions within like unions. Like some offices within the unions, but no like political office in the country. But yeah, the reason that he, left the country, he was accused of murder.
Oh.
Yeah, he was accused of murder.
When you said he was avoiding jail time, I just thought you meant like all his other laborer friends who were getting arrested for existing. But no, he murdered a guy.
There was a state leader, I believe it was out west. I don't remember if it was Utah or like Wyoming, one of those states, where the governor, I believe it was a governor, a former governor, was cracking down on the labor movement out there, and that guy died
Suspiciously.
suspiciously, and apparently there was a conspiracy that Haywood was attached to, and they had to extradite him from another state out there, because even if he wasn't present for the crime, if he was attached to it in any capacity, they shipped him up to the state to put him in jail. He posted bond, and then he left the country and lived out the rest of his days in Soviet Russia.
Interesting.
Yeah.
A little history within our history.
Yep. I learned a good bit about Haywood. He ended up not learning a lick of Russian while he was there. He married a Russian woman and communicated with her completely in sign language.
That is the most American thing I have ever heard.
Neither one learned each other's language at all.
No. The most American thing I've ever heard was not only moving to another country and not learning that language, but also moving to another country, marrying someone, and still not learning the language.
So fun stuff. Yeah, he died in Soviet Russia. Half his ashes, or were over there, half his ashes were brought back to like Chicago or something like that. And yeah, interesting person.
Super interesting. But, yeah. So after World War II, there was a boom of economic prosperity, with unions not striking during the war. After it was over, workers were eager to use their influence, and a new wave of strikes surged through the nation. The 1947 Taft-Hartley Act restricted authority and power of labor unions. Boo. It restricted what kinds of strikes unions could partake in, what practices they could strike over, and forced labor union leadership to denounce communism. It also legalized right-to-work laws and allowed local governments to ban unions from certain shops. And we are still seeing those repercussions today.
Yeah. I love that part about making labor union leaders sign affidavits against communism. Which started the real... Because I'm not going to say that communism was ever popular in the United States, but it had its base with the working people, with unions. The union leadership were all socialist people, basically, during this time period.
As we've seen, as we've said.
And this is sort of like when you see like a decoupling of labor from leftism in the United States.
Which, again, we're seeing the repercussions of till this day,
And trying to repair that wound is difficult.
I think part of it is, gutting what unions could and could not do. And right-to-work laws are still prevalent in...
Like our state. Gross. The 1960s saw revitalized interest in union membership after the Red Scare crackdowns in the post-war era, and back in 1955, the AFL merged with the Congress of International Organizations, evolving into the AFL-CIO that we know today. Unions did fairly well during this time, creating well-paying manufacturing jobs that people had access to right out of high school that simply don't exist today. And I think that's a shame.
Back when people could afford a house, 2 kids, 2 cars on 1 salary.
Yeah. For, a quote, unskilled worker, unquote.
Reminder, there is no such thing as unskilled labor.
And with full benefits, like a whole retirement plan, health care.
a pension.
Pension plan, yeah. The
Not-
works.
Not just like, not like a 401k that you pay into, no, a pension.
The works.
I always think back to The Simpsons because when it aired, a guy having a nuclear power plant job with no education and a wife and 2 kids and a house was all
3 kids.
3 kids. Yeah, I forgot. 3 kids. He has 3 kids. I forgot about Maggie. Poor Maggie. That was the norm. Like this, it feels weird now, but like this was a norm. Like a stay-at-home wife who there was a time.
And he took care of his dad too.
Yeah, his dad was in a home, so he had to pay that. Or maybe his dad had a good pension, and the pension was paying for his.
Ooh, maybe.
Yeah.
He was a war veteran, right?
Yeah, so. He was like, he was a war veteran, and.
Yeah, that was the future that we could have had, but we lost it. They took that away from us.
Now couples working 40 hours each,
barely getting by.
They can barely afford an apartment, and the dog that they like.
Don't even get the right dog breed anymore.
And it's crazy to me that how far things have happened in like such a short time, like comparatively in history. But on that note, in the last few years, we have seen a rise in union interest and membership. Gen Z is not taking the abuse sitting down, with Starbucks workers united to Amazon warehouse workers unionizing. This is the rise of the labor movement we needed years ago. Anti-union sentiments ran strong for years, but if unions were so bad, why would companies pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to union-busting consultants? Why have captive audience meetings? And for those who don't know what those are, it's basically mandatory meetings at work where you sit down and listen to why your work doesn't need a union. You know what they say, a hit dog hollers.
It's really obvious. Like Amazon and Starbucks, they don't even try to hide it. I know people who work for Amazon, who are in management for Amazon, who have admitted, very nonchalantly, yeah, I had to go to this other warehouse and crack down on some people starting a union there. Like they said that, and it's like, what?
Yeah.
You're just out and saying it like that? You're just doing that as your job?
And I know Starbucks specifically, what they did is everything that the union asked for. A lot of the things that the unions have asked for, non-unionized stores are getting, and the unionized stores aren't getting. And Starbucks just won't come to the table. They literally, the Starbucks Workers United will be there sitting, waiting, and they just don't show up. But they've gotten credit card tip, the non-union stores, which was in the unionized stores contracts that they wanted, was credit card tipping, aprons that are easier, like are full of range. Things like that. And they gave it to the stores that weren't unionized. It's a slap in the face and
disrespectful.
Yeah, Starbucks has been told that what they are doing is against labor laws, and but what these companies are doing, they are against labor laws, but they can do it because what's a $100,000 fine to a multi-billion-dollar corporation?
Right. And we finally do have a National Labor Relations Board that has a little bit of teeth to it, but it's not enough. I don't think, not yet.
Until we continue fighting for more, we are seeing a rise in unions, and that's great.
But we're not going to see the kind of justice that we really need to be seeing until those same workers seize their means of production. So seize your Starbucks. Seize your Amazon warehouse.
And stop calling these big stores. We need to change the way we speak about these big stores. Instead of saying your local Walmart, your local Starbucks. Those are multi-chain restaurant places. It's a Walmart. it's a Starbucks. Yes, they might be local to you, but they are not local. They are ruining the mom and pop stores, and they're ruining the labor movement.
They are a part of your community, but you'll have to decide on whether or not they're a good part of your
Yeah.
community or not.
Remove the local from their names, because they're not.
And unions are good for everyone, and not just those who work in companies who have unions, but those who work in cities and towns with strong union presence. When a company has higher wages, it forces companies around them to increase their own wages to retain talent. Even when not part of a union, workers see their wages benefit from high union density on a state level. The average median weekly wages are $1,122 a week, almost $60,000 in the 10 states with the strongest union density, versus $943 a week, about $50,000, for those in the 10 lowest union density states in 2020. That is a stark difference. That is $10,000.
That's a lot. Like, what could you like? Just think of all the things you could do with $10,000.
Yeah. If someone handed me a check for $10,000, I would take it.
Yeah, I'm not stopping that. That's the other thing. Like that 10,000 can pull you from like
One tax bracket to another.
that, but it also like whether you are getting groceries each week or if you're barely getting gas to go to work.
Yeah, that's an extra $100, $200 a paycheck.
And in this economy, that's a huge difference.
That is, that's groceries for me. Maybe not a whole family, but
Depending on like where you shop. But yeah.
So people could do a lot with that kind of money.
But in addition to higher wages, union members are also more likely to have strong benefits and job protections. According to the American Postal Workers Union, more than 9 in 10 workers, about 95%, covered by union contracts, have access to employer-sponsored health benefits, compared to 68% of non-union workers. Union employers also contribute 77% more per hour worked towards their employees' health coverage than non-union employers. Union workers are much more likely to have paid sick leave, vacation, and holiday leave, as well as job security protection against being fired at will. Benefits. I'm a strong I love benefits. It is part of like
Americans love benefits.
Yeah, so part of your overall package on pay and everything. But that stark difference of like 95 to 68%.
Yeah.
And it's talking about
that's the benefit of having a lot of people banding together and making demands.
Collective bargaining.
Advocating for yourselves as a group.
And if you can't advocate for yourself, just remember you're advocating for your neighbor.
Your coworker, everyone. It's important.
Yeah. America is a nation built on the backs of hard workers. People like you have been exploited time and time again for centuries. Joining or starting a union might just be the trick to breaking this cycle of exploitation. Remember, unions aren't meant to speak for you. They are there to support you for when you are ready to speak for yourself. They are your advocates. Just some final thoughts. We're clearly pro-union here.
Yes.
And maybe you're a bit more convinced to be too. Do you have any other final thoughts?
Start a union. Be a socialist or communist. Read your literature. That's your homework.
We hope you enjoyed this brief history on American labor.
Class dismissed.